So I am going to begin by talking about some relevant theories from heritage studies, which is the conceptual background I'm approaching this study from. So the first is dissonant heritage, which is the idea that any heritage site, whether that's a museum or a memorial, is by nature dissonant because it cannot possibly include the truth and the facts about every possible person or group's experience. That's just impossible. However, some of these dissonances and gaps in covering those things are calculated ones. So some narratives and some pieces of the past are left out on purpose. So looking at dissonant heritage is looking at not only what's missing, but why it's missing, who makes the decisions about what's included and why they do those things. The idea of a heritagescape is looking at a site or perhaps a given memorial landscape. If there's more than one museum or monument that you can, as part of a complex, looking at the boundaries, whether they all fit together in terms of cohesion, and that's not just physically and tangibly, but in terms of the messages that they're sending, and visibility. So what you can see if you're standing in front of one part, what you can see from other ads. So how it all fits together visually and conceptually. Dark heritage and difficult heritage is the study of places that are not exactly places of pride or places of happiness. We often associate heritage with things like great palaces or monuments to an empire, but this is looking at places that might be a little more painful or that people might feel some shame or difficult emotions around. And then the idea of guardians of memory or counter memory. And these are individuals or small groups who are, they would say, protecting dissonant or uncomfortable pasts that don't fit into an overarching narrative for a country or a society. They're often taking care of a physical site or collecting archival material or artifacts, and they are holding on to them and taking care of them, guarding them, one might say, until they can be brought forward into the public or into sometimes the hegemonic narrative discourse. So I hope that gives a little bit of background into the theoretical grounding of this work. So I will be looking at 4 different sites in Moscow and looking at their conceptual heritagescapes, so seeing how their interpretation fits together, particularly in terms of how they portray the victims and perpetrators of Soviet era repression. So you can see on the left, that's all of Moscow, and 3 of the sites are quite close to each other in central Moscow. And then the 4th is down in the southern suburbs. And then you look at the right, you can see that some of them are quite closely centered around the Kremlin, and then they go north. So another really important concept for this work is Judith Butler's Grievability. I have put the long quotation up on this slide, but really it's the idea, and she's writing in the wake of the Iraq War, and the drone war in particular, that some deaths in war or in other types of violence are acceptable because we've already decided that some types of people and some groups are not as grievable. So while they're still alive, we've decided that if they die, and we here is of course a hegemonic group, possibly the opinion of a power holder, if these people die, it won't be as sad. We wouldn't grieve it as much as we would grieve the death of one of our own. So I was thinking through this and thinking, what if you extended this to sites of dark heritage? If you thought about what types of person are more or less grievable than others and how that is reflected in the interpretation of dark heritage sites. So when you look at particularly a place that has a lot of different victims, who's brought forward as the most grievable type of death? And the opposite of that would be, or the complementary would be blameability, which is my own concept. And that's looking at these types of sites, who is brought forward as the most culpable, the most to blame. So I've come up with 3 categories. They are abdication, authoritarian, and complicit, that you can see at sites across Russia and across particularly sites in the Moscow region. So we will talk about this and give some examples as we move forward. But again, the idea is when you go to these places, when you're walking around as a visitor, who is brought forward as the most grievable and who is brought forward as the most blameable in terms of how this happened. So the first case study is the Butovo firing range in the south of Moscow. It was the site of mass shootings by the NKVD from 1937 to 1941. Over 20,000 people are buried there. And after the fall of the Soviet Union, there was some confusion, but it's now being cared for by the Russian Orthodox Church, which includes a memorial church there and this memorial garden from 2017. So you can see, and there's some more photos on the next slide, that it's this sort of memorial plaza, and the lists of people who were killed there are engraved on these walls and they're organized by the day that they were shot, between 1937 and 1938 mostly. So on the next slide, we can see that it's a photo of the church on blood and a photo of a typical interpretation panel at these sites. So the identified victims, although they make a great point of saying how many people were, how many different nationalities were shot there and how many different people, and the intense age range, so from very young people to very old ones. There's a focus particularly on Russian Orthodox clergymen and believers, which does make sense as the site is taken care of by the Russian Orthodox Church. But in terms of the killing, there's no agent referred to. It's not clear who did this. It might as well have been a tidal wave or just people dying for no reason. So I would argue that this is a form of abdication in terms of blameability. So the deaths are grieved, and they're grieved very openly, and it's not that any of these people deserve to die or were culpable in any way, but who is responsible for it is sort of erased. So I have come up with these axes, right, for grievability and blameability. So they go from least blamable to most blamable, left to right, least grievable and most grievable, bottom to top. So no one is really blamed here, but the Russian Orthodox clergy leaders and believers are brought forward as sort of the ideal victims. And so that is why you see a little bit of a difference in terms of where they are on the scale. The second case study I have is the Gulag History Museum, which was founded in 2001. The museum opened a few years later. It's moved to its current location, so outside of really, really central Moscow, a little bit north, in 2016. And unfortunately, these photos are from their old permanent gallery. I was not able, for my PhD dissertation research, to go and see their new gallery, which I understand is very impressive. And it's not just a history museum. There's a very big focus on collecting community history and oral history projects. And it also kind of bills itself as a kind of psychological museum that has some cutting edge museology. So you see here, they've got some artifacts from former prisons. Those are cell doors. And the curator is here showing a text panel concerning Stalin. So one of the big things that this museum does is tries to prove without a doubt that Stalin and his circle of leaders in the Politburo did know what was happening with the Gulag. There is still a train of thought that if Stalin had known about what was happening, he would have stopped it. But the evidence, of course, shows that Stalin and those main leaders were fully aware of what was happening. They signed shooting lists. So that text panel is showing how many shooting lists each of them personally signed. So it's trying to prove that this very top circle of government leaders did know what was happening, and it's their fault. So what the flip side of that is that there's no discussion of how the rank and file perpetrators got involved in this. So no discussion of the thousands or possibly tens of thousands of NKVD operatives who were really arresting people and interrogating them and shooting them on the local and regional levels. So one important historical point gets handled, but the question of why, quote unquote, an ordinary man, to use Robert Browning's term, would get involved with this goes totally unaddressed. So in terms of the victims, the focus is on the victims of the major shooting operations, and they use the personal objects of victims and as well as the people who were sent to the Gulag, hence the name. So there's a big emphasis on using, or there was in the old permanent gallery, their personal objects, and then there is a focus on elite victims as well, so whether those were artists or politicians. And as I mentioned, there's a major emphasis on proving the guilt of Stalin and the Politburo, which would put this into the authoritarian model of blameability, where it focused specifically on a circle of top leaders and then doesn't deal with the rank and file perpetrators at all. So here is the axis of that for the Gulag Museum, where you can see the types of victims who are really focused on as the most grievable. And then at the bottom here, you can see some of the people who are held culpable for it. The third case study is the new Wall of Grief Memorial, which is pretty close to the city center in Moscow. So it's in response to the calls for a national monument to victims of repression that have been going on since the mid-'80s. A competition to design the monument, which a fund related to the Gulag Museum was heavily involved with, was held a couple of years ago. And this was officially opened on October 30, the Day of Remembrance of Victims of Political Repression in 2017, at an opening ceremony where Putin attended and gave a speech that said that this was a terrible thing that should never happen, but it managed to never name Stalin or any other top leader of the time. So you can see some photos here. A really interesting aspect of this monument in terms of heritage is these stones that have been brought from different parts of Russia that had Gulag camps or forced settlements, and they have little metal discs on them. So if you want to lay flowers or candles or anything else on a piece, quote unquote, or part of the location where you know somebody or that you really, somebody was sent, you can look it up on a little plaque and then sort of in that way travel to that place and lay your object of remembrance there. So in terms of materiality and moving these parts of a very large and far-flung country into the center, this is very interesting. So the Wall of Grief, it shows stylized depictions of victims. The stones, as I said, are an extremely interesting memorial manifestation, but there's really no mention of perpetrators at all. And in fact, there's really no written interpretation of the site. There's just a plaque saying that it is the Wall of Grief and that Putin opened the site when it opened. So the axis here is just like this. Everybody is grievable. They're all in one group and no one is held accountable at all. So for sure, an abdication model. So the final case study is case 4, which is It Is Right Here, which is both digital and focused on the landscape. So outside of the the Lubyanka building in central Moscow, which was the NKVD and later KGB headquartered, is still owned by the FSB. There is a boulder from the Solovetsky Islands that has been brought there as a memorial to all of the victims of repression from the Soviet era. And so it stands there, looking straight at the Lubyanka building, which makes it very interesting in terms of the Heritagescape because they are totally intervisible from each other. So although there was, in theory, a small museum of the Secret Services inside that Lubyanka building for a while, it's now closed. No one can get in. There's no plaques or other memorial hardware or anything like that on the building. So, but this stone kind of stands there, staring it down as a message that it's not going to be forgotten, and neither will these people. So it is the site of a very moving and effective memorial every year on the 29th of October, where people come for 12 hours and stand in line and read the names of Moscow-era victims. And they also add the names of their own family members who were repressed if they'd like to. So on top of this memorial, which is the quite famous NGO that works with historic as well as contemporary victims of repression, has put forward this digital initiative called It Is Right Here, which usually again centers on this stone and has tours that go all around Moscow. You can sometimes follow a guide or you can download it on your own and go from site to site. And they focus on, again, these kind of hidden histories behind these buildings. You would never know, for example, that some of these places, they look like nondescript buildings, but they actually were the sites of mass shootings for years in the 30s. So the emphasis in it is on the continuity of the fact that the Secret Services and the government still own many of these buildings and are still keeping it silent, but you can walk around and remember them even if there isn't a monument or a memorial in front of them. So some of the tour itineraries focus on high-profile victims like Varlam Shalamov, but there are also itineraries focusing on politicians, dissidents, and everyday people. And if you can't go in person, of course, you can go on their website and click on each place and see photographs and read some information about the places and their stories. So it's an interesting multi-layered thing where the silent quote unquote buildings get layered with this digital or in-person data, but you also don't have to be there at all if you don't want to. You can follow the itinerary from wherever you are. And they do recognize some individual perpetrators, which include political and NKVD leaders. And they do some talk about lower down, lower ranking NKVD workers, functionaries, and other collaborators. So here you can see another shot of the "It Is Right Here" ceremony, as well as an information panel they put outside the shooting house, which is where many, many people were sentenced to death during the Great Terror, and it is going to become a shopping mall because it's so close to the Kremlin. So here, because there are so many different actors, this is an incomplete axis, but it shows, again, the types of people who are brought forward as the most grievable victims, and then some of the most culpable perpetrators. The NKVD functionaries are sort of in the middle of this because there is some recognition, particularly in the walking tours, that many of them later became victims of later waves of the repression, which is a very fraught aspect of this historic phenomenon and its heritage. It's very difficult to categorize people like that, and there are ongoing debates about whether or not they count as victims, whether it depends on how far up in the hierarchy you were, what you personally did. So, as you might know from the conversations about the Komunarka plaques and putting some heads of the NKVD on that because they were later shot, it's an extremely live and fraught topic. So when you map and analyze who is deemed grievable and blamable and by what degree, this can shed light on why the stakeholders of each site, and there are very many stakeholders here ranging from the church to NGOs to Moscow City Museums or affiliates of it, what they think is important to remember and why. So both the abdication and authoritarian models, close the issue and leave it in the past. If you don't talk about rank and file perpetrators, then you don't have those conversations about why people get involved with something like this, what their motivations are, whether they felt they had a choice, which also means you can't really talk about how you would stop people or how you would stop yourself from doing something like that in a situation that was becoming a repressive one in the contemporary world. So it closes the issue and it stops any reflection on contemporary human rights abuses or slides into authoritarianism in any country and from any background. So the third thing, which is complicit blameability, which would focus on the motivations and actions of rank and file perpetrators, invites introspection both into the history and into how we act now. But there are also these shades of complicity that invite analysis, especially in terms of how they're interpreted. So again, the issue of these lower ranking NKVD workers and functionaries who later became victims is, again, really difficult to deal with and particularly to interpret. But it's one of the most interesting parts because it shows how people, struggle with not having a category to put people into and how that bleeds over into contemporary conversations. And this variety of manifestations reflects the widespread ambivalence and uncertainty about the legacies and absences of Stalinist repression. So I hope that these theories and these frameworks are useful, and I'm happy to help us think through what's going on here in Russia and further abroad as well. And I will be happy to discuss this and answer any questions. So thank you very much.